The answer to Hypo 15 is yes, Garden has breached by refusing to perform the contract as it was originally drafted. Notice that this is a non-UCC contract, a contract for services. Therefore, the consideration doctrine applies in its common law form. Let me now summarize for you the rule you need to know to solve this problem. And that rule is the common law rule on whether a promise to modify a contract is enforceable. The common law rule is that a promise of modification that benefits only one side normally lacks consideration and is therefore unenforceable. This rule is a consequence of what is usually called the pre-existing duty rule. The idea is that where one party promises to modify a contract for the sole benefit of the other party, and that the other party, the beneficiary of the promise to modify, merely promises in return to perform the same duties as he was already obliged to perform, the beneficiary has not given consideration for the promise of modification. You may remember from law school the general saying about past consideration that encapsulates the idea behind the pre-existing duty rule. As that saying goes, past consideration is no consideration, unquote. So the pre-existing duty rule and the sub-rule that promises to modify are unenforceable if they benefit only the promisee. These are simply illustrations of this more general idea that past consideration doesn't count as consideration. Let's apply the pre-existing duty rule to these facts. O has promised to modify the contract in a way that helps only Garden, not O. We can see this from the fact that O promised to pay the same money for less work. Nothing in this arrangement helps O at all, since Garden is merely promising to do the same things that he was already obligated to do, except fewer of them. Since Garden is not doing anything or giving up anything in return for O's promise of modification, Garden is deemed not to have furnished consideration for that modification promise. Therefore, O is not bound to honor his promise to modify the contract, and he is entitled to hold Garden to the original contract. If Garden then refuses to honor the original contract, it's Garden who is in breach. So you can see that, although on its face this problem has to do with the modification of a contract, it's a consideration problem in disguise. In a non-UCC context, a promise by one party to modify the contract to the sole benefit of the other party will normally be unenforceable for lack of consideration under the pre-existing duty rule. Okay, let's move on to Hypo 16, which is a variation on the facts of the hypo we were just doing. Now, however, assume that the reason for Garden's request to skip the side yard sodding is that the wholesale price of sod has unexpectedly gone up 40% in 1 week due to a strike that could not have been foreseen at the time of the original agreement. O agrees that Garden can skip the side yard while still collecting the full $10,000. Assume that if Garden doesn't have to sod the side yard, the benefit to him will approximately offset the greater cost to him of the sod for the front and rear yards. As in the prior hypo, O changes his mind and demands that Garden include the side yard in order to be paid. If Garden skips the side yard while doing all the rest of the work, is he entitled to have a court enforce the full $10,000 price? The answer is yes. O's promise of a modification is binding, so the outcome here is opposite to the outcome in Hypo 15. As I mentioned in our discussion of Hypo 15, the general rule is that a promise to modify that is unilaterally beneficial to the promisee is not enforceable against the promisor due to the pre-existing duty rule and the lack of consideration for the promise of modification. But there is an extremely important exception to the pre-existing duty rule. A promise to make a unilaterally beneficial modification is binding on the promisor if the modification is fair and equitable in light of changed circumstances that were not anticipated by the parties when the original contract was made. It's easy to apply this rule to our facts here. Garden made a fixed-price deal to supply and install a certain amount of sod, and his materials costs have gone up significantly post-contract. I've told you that this wholesale price increase could not reasonably have been anticipated at the time the contract was made. I've also told you that the value to Garden of getting to drop the side yard work is about equal to his increased wholesale costs of buying the front and backyard sod. The modification here meets both requirements for our exception. It was motivated by changed circumstances not reasonably anticipated by either party when the contract was made. It is fair and equitable in light of those changed circumstances. The change in circumstances that is required to trigger this exception to the pre-existing duty is much less than is required for the doctrine of impracticability, which we'll cover later. So, even if the total impact of the wholesale price rise on Garden's overall profit from the job would not be nearly enough to excuse him from the contract for impracticability, that price rise qualifies Garden for the fair and equitable modification due to changed circumstances exception to the pre-existing duty rule. Let's move on to another hypo, number 17. Painter agrees to paint all 10 rooms of O's house for $10,000. Performance to be completed by February 1. One day later, Painter asks for another $1,000 without giving any reason for the request. O orally agrees that O will pay the extra $1,000, but only on condition that Painter finishes the work by January 31 rather than February 1. Painter, in fact, finishes by January 31, but O tenders only $10,000 to him. Does O owe Painter the remaining $1,000? The answer is, O is bound by his promise to modify the contract. This hypo illustrates a second important exception to the common law pre-existing duty rule. If the party who has merely promised to do essentially what he is already obligated to do assumes the slightest additional or even different duties, or gives even a very small extra benefit to the party who is agreeing to the modification, there is consideration for that modification. As I hope you can see, the facts of Hypo 17 fit this extra or different duties exception like a glove. Painter has promised to complete the work one day earlier. Even though this is a very small modification of Painter's duties, that small modification on Painter's side is enough that the pre-existing duty rule no longer applies. Painter has not merely promised to do what he is already obligated to do. He's promised to undertake the slight extra burden of getting the job done one day earlier. That extra burden on his side is enough to furnish consideration for O's return promise to increase the contract amount by $1,000. So O's promise to increase the amount is binding on him. And, by the way, it doesn't matter that the value to O, or even the market price of Painter's finishing one day earlier, is far less than the $1,000 that O is in effect paying for that earlier finish.